Welcome to another episode of Draw This. In this episode, we're going to draw an eyeball. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll be using Painter 2015 today. The first thing I'm going to do is select the elliptical shape tool, and I'm going to make sure that I have no fill and I have a black stroke. You can click on the shape properties to get more options. I'm going to choose a width of 10. I think that'll work pretty well. If you hold shift, you'll be able to draw a perfect circle. If you use the move tool, you can go ahead and move that circle wherever you like. And we're going to make sure that our eyeball's in proportion, so we're going to draw another smaller circle, and then we're going to move it over, and we're going to duplicate it by holding Alt and dragging. Then we're going to select both of those circles and use Control-T to scale them up. We'll delete the duplicate, and what we want is we want that inner circle to be half the size of the bigger circle. We want to repeat that again with the pupil. So now we have everything in proportion. We can delete our duplicate. We'll go ahead and select all three of these layers, and we'll go to Layers, Align Horizontal Center. And then we'll do that again. We'll go to Layers, Align Vertical Center. That will center all of these circles on each other. Let's group those layers, and we'll give them names based on their anatomical name. We'll go ahead and create a new layer for a center line, and we'll use the scratchboard tool while holding Shift to go ahead and divide this eyeball right in half. That'll help us get the rest of the eye in proportion. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and convert these shape layers into default layers by right-clicking on them and choosing Convert to Default Layer. And now if we collapse that group, we can go ahead and dim the opacity of the whole group. Let's create a new layer, and we'll use the detail oils to go ahead and sketch a little bit. We'll draw a horizontal guide right under the pupil, and we'll place our tear duct below the horizontal lines, and the opposite corner of the eye will be above the horizontal lines. You want to cover the iris a little bit on the top and bottom side. And then what you want to do is go ahead and just connect all of those lines together, and that will be your eyeball shape. Now everybody has a different shape for their eyeballs, so this is just kind of a general eyeball shape. I'll go ahead and thicken the edges a little bit everywhere just to clean it up, and then draw on the tear duct in the side of the eyes. I'll erase that guide, and then I'll go ahead and draw a little bit of the eyelid. When you're drawing eyes, you always want to consider that the eyeball is underneath and it's bulging out the eye. It's a sphere. So you want to give it spherical shading. We'll go ahead and draw the bottom side of the eyelid, and then add a few more details here and there. I'll add the indication of some eyelashes over on the far side of the eye. Just a few for now. I won't worry about doing too many, but we just want to get an idea for the direction that they're going. I'm going to dim the opacity of that sketch layer, and then I'll create a second layer to go ahead and do my inking. I'm going to use the scratchboard tool for this. And I'm going to try to be really careful when I ink and do nice smooth lines. If I don't get a good line, I'll just do an undo and keep doing undos until I get it right. I think that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and hide the original sketch layer and the guides because we don't need them anymore. We'll create a new layer for lashes, and we'll go ahead and draw on those lashes again. We'll try to do a cleaner job this time. Next, we'll create several layers for some shading. I'm going to give these names based on the part of the anatomy that I'm drawing. Then I'm going to group them together, and then we'll go ahead and order these from foreground to background. I'm going to start with the face layer and go ahead and fill it with a number 2 value. That gives us a good base color to start with. I'm going to go to the eyeball layer, and I'm going to use the scratchboard tool to go ahead and fill that in with a slightly lighter value. And what I'm going to do is basically just block in all of these different areas. So the eyeball is going to be an area, the iris will be a different layer, and the pupil will be a different layer. I'm going to go to the iris layer and use a number 6 value to fill that in. And layer order is really important here. Sometimes you have to kind of play around with the order of the layers to figure out what makes sense. In this case, it makes more sense to have the pupil above the iris layer and the iris above the eyeball. So I changed the layer order a little bit. I've gone ahead and filled in the remaining layers. And then what I'll do is I'll go ahead and add a highlight. We'll put that highlight up above the line work so that it doesn't get covered up. And then here and there we'll add a few more little highlights. This really helps the eye look reflective and wet and glossy as it should. So here and there, just a few little spots. This will really make it pop out. If you don't do this, your eye is going to look kind of flat. I'm going to go ahead and add some shading with the airbrush now to each of these layers. I'll start with the eyeball layer, and I'm going to use a darker value to go ahead and add a shadow on the top side. This shadow is being cast by the eyelid. I'm going to add some shadow along the side to make it look nice and spherical. Now we'll add some reflections on the top edge because the eye is a nice reflective orb shape. We'll go to the eyelid layer and we'll add some shadow that's being cast from the brow. Our light's coming from the bottom right, so we want to shade all of these shapes appropriately. Just think of them all as their own individual 3D shapes. Let's add some shading to the face. You want to think about the orbital cavity, or the hole where the eye goes into. You want to make sure that you shade that, and that it looks like the eye is kind of bulging out of that hole. I'm going to build up the form using light and dark, and then I'm going to add a little bit of shading to the iris now. The iris should have that same cast shadow from the eyelid. And then what you can do is go ahead and start to add some lighter and darker areas along the sides and in the center, depending on the kind of eye that you want to do. I'm going to go ahead and add a little light spot, and then here and there I'll add some radial lines. I'll kind of divide it up like a pizza or a pie. I'm going to add some shading to the pupil. It's important to avoid coloring the pupil solid black because the pupil usually has the environment reflected in it. So I like to draw kind of like a person shape with a little bit of backlight on it, because sometimes when you're taking a picture of yourself or someone's photographing an eyeball, you see that inside of it. I add a little bit more detail to the iris and then zoom out to evaluate. We want to look at this eye kind of small to get a good feel for how it's looking. You don't want to look at it too big. We'll add a layer for veins, and we'll use the detail oils to go ahead and draw in some indication of some veins now. The plan here is to go ahead and do this in black and white to make sure that all of our value structure looks good. Sometimes it's necessary to change the composite method for layers, so I'm going to change this to multiply. That way it blends in a little bit better with the layers underneath. I'm going to return to the sketch layer, which is the line work, turn on preserve transparency, select a number 5 value in the airbrush, and I'm going to lighten those lines a little bit so it doesn't look so much like a cartoon or a comic. Then I'm going to select a darker value and bring back the shadows in a few places. So I want these to be lines, but I don't want them to be all the same color. I'm going to fade the lines into the form. Next, I'll select all of the eye layers except for the lashes and go ahead and merge them with Control E. I'll delete the sketch because we don't need that anymore. And let's rename those merged layers to eye. I'll turn off preserve transparency, and we'll use the diffuse blur to go ahead and blend some of those areas of the lines to blend them into the form and make them look less like outlines and more like part of the form that we're drawing now. It's kind of an interesting way that you can turn something that was kind of a comic book line art style into something more painterly. Let's create a new layer for gloss. This will help the eye look more glossy, like it's glass or reflective. We'll select the airbrush and we'll paint some white over some different areas of the eye here. Just a little bit of gloss will do the trick. You don't need to go too far because you don't want to cover up all the detail in your eye. You can use the distort brush to kind of push things around and add some sharp edges, smudge things around and make it look reflective. Make sure that's set to a screen layer, and then if you want, you can use the airbrush with black to go ahead and back that down in some places by painting over it. Next, we'll add some shading to the eye on a new layer called Shadow. We'll change it to a multiply composite method, and we'll use the airbrush to go ahead and add in some darker areas to just kind of build this form up a little bit more. We'll enhance the form with the shadows, so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're painting generally on the sides that aren't facing towards the light. I'm going to add a little bit of vignette on the face, and we'll create another new layer for highlights. You'll see I'm going back and forth with these light and dark layers to build things up. The reason why I use a lot of layers is because it's less risk of messing anything up. I'll add some fine highlights with a small brush, and maybe add a few more lashes with the detail oils on their own layer. That way if I don't get them right, that's okay, and then I can always blend behind the lashes if I need to. I'm going to return to the eye layer and go ahead and try to balance out some of the light and dark a little bit using the airbrush, and just continue adding form to build up the shape of the eye. Now let's add a little bit of texture on a new layer. Texture is more often than not a multiply composite method. We'll select a dark gray value and we'll use the sponge to just go ahead and paint over the whole eye to give it some skin texture. We can dim the opacity of that layer to make a more subtle blend. Let's add more texture on a second layer. This time we'll go ahead and use the chalk, and you can feel free to experiment with the different paper textures, but basic paper tends to work pretty well. We'll dim the opacity on that a little bit, and then we'll go ahead and return to the highlights layer, and we'll use an airbrush to give it a little bit of a white glow. We'll add a little bit of white over the eye itself too to make it look more glossy. Next, let's go ahead and group all of those eye layers together. We'll name that group eye. Let's create a new layer and let's begin adding some color tinting now. So we'll start with the skin color. We'll create a group. That way all of our color goes into a group. And we want all of our tints to be multiply composite methods. So I'm going to choose multiply and then pick kind of an orange skin color. I'm going to choose fill, and if I don't get a color I like, I can keep hunting around until I find one that I do like. You may need to shift it towards red or towards yellow depending on the skin color you like. And then I'm going to go ahead and use the airbrush to vary the color. So I'm going to change it a little bit in hue and a little bit in value just to get a little bit of variety. Then I'm going to dim the opacity of that layer. I'm going to create another layer for a skin tint, and it'll be the same. It'll be a multiply composite method. I'll go ahead and fill it the same way with a similar orange peach color. And layering up these tints really helps this to look a little more realistic. We'll create a new layer for red. It's really important to add red to drawings of people because the red kind of represents the blood that's under the skin, and you can especially see red in people's eyes, especially in their tear ducts and in the corner of their eyes and surrounding their eyelid. You want to make sure that's a multiply composite method. And we'll go ahead and create a new layer for iris. This will be the iris color. We'll go ahead and add some green and kind of back down the opacity, maybe conceal it here and there if I need to. I'll create a new layer for light. This will be some lighter areas. And I'll just kind of use a lighter skin color to go ahead and add some of my highlights in. This is kind of like how you would do it if you were acrylic or oil painting. I'm going to create a new layer for some tinting. That'll be an overlay composite method this time. And I can feel free to just experiment with different colors to get some pretty interesting effects. If I select the airbrush and add a mask to that layer, I can paint with black inside that mask to conceal some of that overlay tinting. So now I get a nice blend of the two different colors. I'll add a second overlay layer with some yellow, and then we'll go ahead and save a copy of our artwork and then drop all. I'm going to make a duplicate of that layer by doing select all, copy, paste, and place. Then we'll choose effects, tonal control, equalize. You can go ahead and just click the auto set button, and then we'll go ahead and dim the opacity. This will balance out the light and dark a little bit if it's too dark. We'll go ahead and select drop all again. Let's duplicate this again with all, copy, paste, and place, and this time we'll choose effects, focus, soften. We'll add a mask to that layer and use black with the airbrush to conceal right in the center. This adds a little bit of soft focus around the edge of the composition. We'll choose drop all again, and we'll blend a little bit with the diffuse blur anywhere where we need to smooth out some of those transitions in color, especially around the eyelid and just here and there and everywhere where you think it needs it. Let's create a new layer for some blood vessels. We'll set the composite method to multiply. We'll select blue and we'll use the sponge to paint in some blood vessels under the skin. We'll select red and we'll do the same. This helps it look nice and realistic and lifelike. We'll continue adding details to this eye with a little bit of color and some highlights here and there, lightening and darkening as much as we need to really balance this out and help it look a little more finished. Let's add some color reflected in the eye. Maybe this is something that's across from the eyeball that's reflecting like somebody's shirt. But these little details really help this look more realistic and more lifelike. I'm going to add a slightly more cyan blue, and then maybe some yellows here and there. Let's create a new layer, and we'll choose color for the composite method. We'll go ahead and fill everything with black, and this shows us our artwork in black and white. This helps us evaluate the value structure, so if we need to lighten or darken anywhere, we can do that. You want it to look good in black and white as well as color. Let's use the bulge tool to go ahead and even out the iris if it's a little bit flat. I'll just kind of bulge out the edge. Then we'll create a new layer for some more lashes. Make sure they all fan out from the eyeball and they don't all go the same direction. Don't make them too thick and don't make them too thin. Don't make them too sparse. We'll go ahead and add some detail to the inner eye using some more peach and red flesh colors. And then we'll add some more veins on a new layer. We'll make that a multiply composite method and draw with the detail oils in red. We'll just keep adding fine details here and there and everywhere. These little details really make the piece come together. We'll use the pinch brush to go ahead and sharpen some areas like the top of the eyelid and the corner of the eye. And then let's add more lashes. You can never get enough lashes. Let's use a particle brush called Scratches to go ahead and add some little cracks in the skin. I think this looks kind of like skin cells from a distance. I'm using multiple layers with overlay, multiply, and screen composite methods. And then I'm reducing the opacity of each layer so that I just get a little subtle blend of this skin texture. I think this looks really nice for a really close-up view of the eye. And then I'm going to go ahead and add a screen layer, and add some light color using the chalk. This will look like oil reflecting off of the skin or lighter skin cells. And then you can go ahead and mask out some of that. If you make a screen composite method, you can paint with black over it to conceal it a little bit. Next, we'll go ahead and drop all, and we'll add some final layers of color tinting here and there to really bring this piece together and add a little more contour to the eye. I'm going to use some magenta and some orange, and then I'll vignette the edges with white to make this look a little more like a sketch. So there you go. We have a finished realistic eye from beginning to end. If you enjoyed this episode of Draw This, take a quick second to like this video and share it with your friends. And don't forget to click the subscribe button to get updates when I release new episodes of Draw This. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Tuesday for another episode of Draw This.